September 7th, 1191. The Mediterranean sun hangs in the sky like a furnace. The air itself feels heavy, thick, almost impossible to breathe. And on a narrow coastal road between Acre and Jaffa, 12,000 crusaders are slowly dying. Not in some glorious charge, not in a clash of swords that bards will sing about. No, they're dying inch by inch, arrow by arrow, horse by horse, man by man. For 5 straight hours, they've been marching through hell. Saladin's cavalry circles them like wolves around wounded prey. Thousands of horse archers sweeping in, loosing arrows, vanishing before anyone can strike back. The screams of dying horses fill the air, the thud of bodies hitting sand, the endless, maddening whistle of arrows that never seems to stop. And at the center of this chaos stands Richard the Lionheart, King of England, commander of the Third Crusade, the most feared warrior in Christendom. He watches his rear guard getting torn to pieces. The Hospitallers, elite knights in black mantles, are taking the worst of it. Their horses are dying beneath them. Their men are falling. Their commander, Garnier de Nablus, has ridden to Richard 3 times now. Your Majesty, let us charge. For the love of God, let us charge. And 3 times, Richard has given the same answer. No. Why? Why would a king famous for his courage, his aggression, his absolute fury in battle, why would he stand there and watch his own men die? Here's what you need to understand. Richard wasn't being cautious. He wasn't being a coward. He was being something far more dangerous. He was being patient. And that patience was about to break Saladin's undefeated army. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why the Battle of Arsuf became one of the most legendary victories in medieval history, to understand how Richard pulled off something that bordered on the impossible, we need to go back to why these men were on this road in the first place, back to a strategy so simple it was almost invisible. See, here's the thing everyone gets wrong about the Third Crusade. They think Richard marched south to reach Jerusalem. He didn't. Jerusalem was the ultimate goal, yes. The holy city. The reason tens of thousands of men had crossed the known world, left their families, spent their fortunes, and sworn to die in foreign sand if that's what God demanded. But Richard understood something that most crusaders before him had learned the hard way. You don't take Jerusalem by wanting it. You take it by building the infrastructure to hold it. And that meant one thing. Jaffa, a port city 60 miles south of Acre. Unremarkable, not particularly beautiful, definitely not holy. But strategically, Jaffa was everything. Think about it. You're leading an army through hostile territory. The desert wants to kill you. The enemy wants to kill you. Disease wants to kill you. Your supply lines stretch back hundreds of miles to the coast, and every day they get thinner. Vulnerable. Easier to cut. How do you survive? You hug the coast. You keep the Mediterranean at your back. You make sure that no matter how far you march, ships can reach you with food, water, weapons, fresh troops. That's not cowardice. That's logistics. And logistics win wars. Jaffa was the key. If Richard could take Jaffa and hold it, he'd have a permanent supply base, a foothold that couldn't be starved out, a launching point for any future assault on Jerusalem. Without Jaffa? The crusade was just a very expensive way to die in the desert. Saladin knew this. Oh, Saladin absolutely knew this. The Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the man who had united the Muslim world, the commander who had shattered the Crusader kingdoms at Hattin just 4 years earlier and reclaimed Jerusalem itself. Saladin was many things. Brilliant, patient, ruthless when necessary, but above all, he was a strategist. He looked at maps the way a chess master looks at a board. He saw moves ahead. He understood what Richard wanted before Richard had even fully formed the plan. And he understood exactly what would happen if the Crusaders reached Jaffa. If they got that port, they'd never leave. They'd have a permanent base, a wound in the side of his empire that would bleed and never heal. So Saladin made a decision. Richard would never reach Jaffa. Not through pitched battle. Saladin was too smart for that. He'd seen what happened when armies met crusader knights in direct combat. He'd watched the flower of Muslim cavalry shattered by those armored monsters at battles across the Holy Land. No. He'd do this the smart way. The patient way. He'd make the march itself so brutal, so bloody, so absolutely unbearable that Richard's army would disintegrate before it ever saw Jaffa's walls. And for the first 100 miles, his plan worked perfectly. The march from Acre began on August 22nd. 12,000 crusaders, a mix of English, French, German, Italian, the remnants of European, armies that had sailed across the Mediterranean to answer the Pope's call. Knights in heavy armor, infantry with crossbows and spears, servants, priests, surgeons, farriers, and one king who had bet everything on reaching the coast. Richard organized his column with almost obsessive precision. The sea on the right. Always the sea. That flank couldn't be outflanked. The Mediterranean itself was his shield. The left flank, the landward side, that was where death would come from. So Richard packed it with infantry. Crossbowmen with their deadly accurate weapons. Spearmen to hold the line if cavalry got too close. And the knights? The heavy cavalry that everyone expected to lead glorious charges? Richard put them in the center of the column. Protected, reserved, forbidden, absolutely forbidden to charge without his direct order. This was the formation. This was the discipline that would either save them or get them all killed. And from the moment they left Acre, Saladin started testing it. Day 1, horse archers appear on the hills. Arrows arc down, men fall. The column keeps moving. Day 2, the attacks intensify. Cavalry probes the flanks, looking for weakness. The crossbowmen answer. Horses scream and fall. The column keeps moving. Day 3, Day 4, Day 5. Every single day, from dawn to dusk, the attacks never stop. Imagine it. You're a crusader knight. You've trained your whole life for mounted combat. Your sword, your lance, your warhorse, these are extensions of your body. You know exactly how to shatter an enemy formation with one devastating charge, and you're being told to just take it. Arrows slam into your shield. Your horse stumbles, blood running from a dozen wounds. Your squire falls beside you, an arrow through his throat. And you can see the enemy, right there, just a few hundred yards away, laughing at you, daring you to come. But the order holds. No charge, no pursuit. Keep formation. Keep moving. This is what Richard demanded. This impossible discipline. And for 16 days, against every instinct, against every fiber of their training, his army obeyed. The Crusaders covered barely 10 miles a day. A crawl. An agonizing, bloody crawl down the coast while Saladin's forces circled and struck and vanished like smoke. Hundreds died. Horses were lost. Men collapsed from heat and exhaustion. The wounded had to be carried or left behind. But the formation held. And with every passing day, Saladin grew more frustrated. Here's what Saladin was counting on. Crusaders were predictable. For a century, Muslim commanders had studied them. They knew the pattern. They knew the weakness. Crusader knights were devastating in a charge. Absolutely devastating. Those armored men on their massive war horses could shatter almost any formation that stood against them. But they had one fatal flaw. They couldn't resist charging. Show them an enemy, insult their honor, kill a few of their friends. Sooner or later, usually sooner, some hothead would break ranks. He'd spur his horse forward, sword raised, screaming for blood, and then the trap would spring. Because horse archers don't stand and fight heavy cavalry. They run, they scatter, they lead the knights on a chase across miles of desert, shooting backwards from the saddle, picking off horses and men until the crusaders are exhausted, disorganized, spread across the landscape in small, isolated groups. Then the real cavalry comes in, fresh, fast, merciless, and the knights die alone, far from their infantry, far from any support. This was how Saladin had won at Hattin. This was how Muslim armies had been defeating crusaders for generations: provoke the charge, punish the pursuit, win without ever facing that terrifying frontal assault. And Saladin was certain, absolutely certain, that sooner or later Richard's army would crack. But Richard wasn't like the commanders Saladin had faced before. He'd studied, he'd listened, he'd learned from every crusader defeat of the past century, and he understood exactly what Saladin was trying to do. The harassment wasn't random, it was a trap. A slow, patient, agonizing trap designed to make the crusaders destroy themselves, and Richard refused to step into it. Every night he walked through the camp, talked to his knights, talked to the infantry, reminded them why they couldn't charge, why they had to endure. "Saladin wants you to attack," he told them. "He's begging you to attack. The moment you break formation, you're dead. Your brothers are dead. The crusade is dead. Is that what you want? To give him exactly what he wants?" The men grumbled. They cursed. Some of them probably cursed Richard himself, quietly where he couldn't hear. But they held. Day after day after day, they held. And something started to change. Saladin's commanders began reporting something strange. The crusaders weren't breaking. They weren't even slowing down. Despite the casualties, despite the constant pressure, that column kept grinding south like some unstoppable machine. For the first time, doubt crept into the Ayyubid camp. What if harassment wasn't enough? What if Richard actually made it to Jaffa? Saladin faced a choice. He could keep up the current strategy, hoping the crusaders would eventually crack. But every mile they covered was a mile closer to that port, a mile closer to permanent Christian presence on his coast. Or he could escalate, force a real battle, commit his full army, try to overwhelm the crusaders with sheer numbers before they reached their goal. It was risky. Saladin knew what crusader knights could do in a stand-up fight. He'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of engagement. But Richard had left him no choice. On September 7th, near the forests of Arsuf, Saladin made his decision. Today, the crusaders would break, one way or another. Today, he would throw everything he had at them. The morning started like every other morning. Arrows from the hills, cavalry probes on the left flank, the familiar grinding rhythm of harassment that the crusaders had endured for over 2 weeks. But something was different. The veterans could feel it. More riders on the horizon, the drums louder, the attacks more coordinated, more persistent. And then, around mid-morning, the full weight of Saladin's army appeared. Thousands upon thousands of cavalry, Mamluks in gleaming armor, Turkish horse archers by the regiment, Kurdish heavy cavalry, Bedouin riders from the desert tribes, the combined military might of Egypt and Syria assembled for one purpose: destroy the crusade. Here, now, today. Richard saw them massing and understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't harassment anymore. This was the battle. He sent riders down the column with new orders: tighten formation, protect the horses, crossbowmen to the front. And above all, above everything, no one charges without the signal. The signal would be 6 trumpet blasts. 2, groups of 3. Until those trumpets sounded, every man was to hold position no matter what happened. No matter what. What followed was 5 hours of pure, unrelenting hell. Saladin's army attacked in waves, not the hit-and-run skirmishes of the previous weeks. Real attacks, sustained assaults designed to crack the crusader formation through sheer, overwhelming pressure. Horse archers swept in close, dangerously close, loosing arrows at point-blank range before wheeling away. The crusader infantry raised their shields and endured. Crossbowmen returned fire, but for every Saracen who fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. The noise was indescribable, thousands of hooves, thousands of voices screaming in Arabic and Turkish, the constant hiss and thud of arrows, the crash of bodies hitting the ground, and through it all, the crusaders kept marching. Slowly, agonizingly, step by bloody step, the worst of it fell on the rear guard. The Hospitallers held the back of the column, the most dangerous position, the place where Saladin's cavalry concentrated their fury. These were the elite of the elite, knights who had sworn their lives to the defense of pilgrims and the destruction of Islam's enemies. And they were being slaughtered, not through any failure of courage, not through any lack of skill. They were simply outnumbered, outranged, and forbidden to fight back the way they'd been trained. Horses collapsed beneath their riders, pin-cushioned with arrows. Knights fell and couldn't rise under the weight of their armor. Squires died trying to protect their masters. And still the order held, no charge. Garnier de Nablus, the Hospitaller Grand Master, was a man of legendary patience, a diplomat as much as a warrior. He understood Richard's strategy. He believed in it. But even his faith was breaking. He rode to Richard once, twice, 3 times. "Your Majesty, we cannot hold. My men are dying where they stand. Let us charge for God's sake. Let us die like knights instead of cattle." And 3 times Richard refused. "Hold," he said. "Trust me, hold a little longer." A little longer? The Hospitallers had been fighting for hours. Their horses were dying. Their men were dying. How much longer could a little longer possibly be? But Garnier obeyed. He rode back to his men, told them to hold, and they held. Now here's what Saladin didn't realize. Every minute that passed, every assault that failed to break the Crusader line, his army was making a fatal mistake. They were getting closer. See, horse archer tactics depend on distance. You sweep in, you shoot, you retreat before the enemy can close with you. The whole system only works if you maintain that gap, that safety margin. But the Crusaders weren't giving them anything to chase. The knights weren't breaking formation. The cavalry wasn't charging out to be picked apart. So Saladin's commanders pushed closer, and closer, and closer. They had to. Their arrows were most effective at short range. Their attacks only worked if they could actually reach the Crusaders. And with every yard they closed, they were tightening a noose around their own necks. Richard saw it happening. He watched the enemy cavalry pressing in, watched the gap between the armies shrinking, and he understood what it meant. Saladin's horsemen were committed now. They couldn't easily disengage. They were too close, too entangled, too focused on finally breaking this impossible Crusader discipline. The trap wasn't just holding, it was about to snap shut. But Richard needed one more thing. He needed Saladin to commit completely, to throw in everything, to close that final distance. So he waited. The sun climbed toward its peak. The heat became unbearable. Men fought in armor that turned into ovens. Horses foamed and stumbled. The ground grew slick with blood and worse. And still Richard waited. 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. The Hospitallers were barely holding together. Their formation was ragged. Knights fought on foot beside their dead horses. Some had thrown away their shields just to swing their swords with both hands. Garnier de Nablus made one more ride to the front. This time he didn't ask permission. "Your Majesty," he said, and his voice was flat. Dead. The voice of a man who has accepted he's going to die. "My knights will charge, with or without your blessing. We cannot endure another hour of this." Richard looked at him, looked back at the enemy lines. The Ayyubid cavalry was everywhere now, completely committed. so close you could see individual faces beneath their helmets. And Richard smiled. "Return to your men," he said. "Listen for the trumpets." What happened next changed everything. Accounts differ on the exact sequence. Some chronicles say the Hospitallers charged before the signal, finally pushed beyond all endurance. Some say Richard gave the order just as they broke. Some say 2 Hospitaller knights, Baldwin de Carew, and a man identified only as the Marshal, spurred their horses forward without orders, and the whole rear guard followed. It doesn't really matter. What matters is this. Sometime around 3 in the afternoon, the crusader cavalry finally charged. And when they did, they hit an enemy that couldn't escape. Understand something about medieval cavalry warfare. A horse archer force, seeing heavy cavalry charge from a distance, has options. They can scatter. They can retreat. They can lead the knights on a merry chase until the horses are exhausted. But a horse archer force that's already close to near contact range? They're trapped. The Ayyubid cavalry had spent all day pressing in against the Crusaders, trying to break that formation, getting closer and closer, meter by meter, until they were practically at sword's length. And now 3,000 Crusader knights were accelerating toward them. The first rank of Saladin's cavalry tried to turn, tried to flee, but there were too many of them packed too closely together. The riders in the rear hadn't even seen the charge begin. They were still pressing forward while their comrades in front desperately tried to escape. The result was chaos. Absolute, catastrophic chaos. The Crusader charge hit like a thunderbolt from God. 3,000 armored knights, horses bred for war, massive destriers that weighed over a ton each, lances leveled, formation tight, months of frustration and rage compressed into one single, devastating moment. The sound alone was terrifying. Thousands of hooves striking packed earth. The rumble building until it shook the ground itself. The Crusaders screaming battle cries in a dozen languages, French, English, German, Italian, all of it blending into one primal roar, and then impact. The front rank of Saladin's cavalry simply ceased to exist. Lances punched through shields, through armor, through flesh. Horses collided with horses. Men were thrown from saddles, trampled, crushed beneath the weight of the charge. The Ayyubid formation didn't break. It shattered. The Crusaders carved through the first line and kept going, into the second line, into the third. Knights who had spent 2 weeks watching their friends die, forbidden to strike back, finally unleashed every ounce of fury they'd been holding. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was a slaughter. Richard himself led the charge. Not from the back, giving orders from safety. Not from some elevated position where he could observe. No. Richard the Lionheart rode at the front, sword in hand, crown on his helmet so every man, friend and enemy alike, would know exactly who was coming for them. The chronicles describe him as something almost supernatural. A demon wrapped in steel, his sword rose and fell like a machine, each stroke finding flesh. Men tried to flee just from seeing him approach. And something undeniable happened that day. The Ayyubid army, the force that had conquered Jerusalem, that had shattered the kingdom of heaven at Hattin, broke. They broke completely. Men threw away their weapons, abandoned their horses, fled on foot toward the forests of Arsuf. Saladin watched from a hill nearby, and for perhaps the first time in his military career, he saw his army run. Now here's where Richard proved he wasn't just a warrior. He was a general. A lesser commander would have kept pushing, would have chased the fleeing enemy for miles, cutting them down, turning a victory into an annihilation. Richard didn't. He knew this could still be a trap. Saladin's army was broken, yes, but broken isn't destroyed. Thousands of Ayyubid cavalry had fled into the forests. If the Crusaders scattered in pursuit, they'd be right back where Saladin wanted them. Isolated, vulnerable, easy prey. So Richard did something that took almost as much discipline as not charging in the first place. He stopped. Trumpets rang out across the battlefield, the recall signal. Knights deep in pursuit reined in their horses. Infantry reformed their lines. And when Saladin's reserves tried a counterattack, they found not scattered groups of exhausted knights, but the same unbreakable formation that had frustrated them all day. The counterattack failed. A second charge failed too. By late afternoon, it was over. The Ayyubid army withdrew. The Crusaders held the ground. The aftermath defied everything Saladin had believed possible. His army had suffered between 7,000 and 10,000 casualties. Emirs dead, Mamluks dead, entire units wiped out. The Crusaders had lost perhaps 700 men, a fraction of the Ayyubid losses. And more importantly, the road to Jaffa was open. On September 10th, 3 days after Arsuf, the Crusader army reached Jaffa. The city fell almost immediately. Its garrison, demoralized by news of the battle, offered only token resistance. Richard had his port, his supply base, his permanent foothold on the coast. The impossible march was complete. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because Arsuf was a victory, an incredible, legendary, against all odds victory, and it changed absolutely nothing. Jerusalem still stood in Muslim hands. Saladin's army was bloodied, but not destroyed. Within weeks, he'd gathered fresh troops. Damascus sent reinforcements. Egypt sent gold. And Richard faced a terrible truth. He could beat Saladin in battle. Arsuf had proved that. In a straight fight, Crusader discipline would triumph almost every time. But he couldn't force Saladin to give him a straight fight. The Sultan had learned his lesson. No more close engagements. From now on, Saladin would trade space for time, retreat before the Crusaders, burn crops, poison wells, let the desert itself fight his battles. Jerusalem sat 30 miles inland, away from any port, any supply line, any hope of reinforcement. To take the city, Richard would have to march his army into territory where Saladin could cut him off, surround him, starve him out. And even if he took Jerusalem, how would he hold it? Richard wasn't going to capture a city he couldn't keep. Twice the Crusader army marched toward Jerusalem. Twice they got within sight of the walls. And twice Richard ordered a retreat. The chronicles say Richard refused to even look at the city. When his officers pointed out Jerusalem on the horizon, he covered his face with his shield. "Lord God," he supposedly said, "if I cannot deliver your holy city, I am not worthy to look upon it." The most famous warrior in Christendom, the man who had defied Saladin at Arsuf, standing with his back to Jerusalem because he knew he could never truly take it. That's the tragedy of the Third Crusade. Richard won every battle. He lost the war. In October 1192, Richard sailed home. He left behind a crusade that had accomplished miracles and fallen short of heaven. The coastal cities were secure: Acre, Jaffa, Tyre, Christian strongholds that would endure for another century. Pilgrims could visit Jerusalem under a negotiated truce with Saladin. But the holy city itself remained under the crescent banner. Richard never returned. He died 7 years later in France, killed by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle. A stupid, pointless death for a man who had survived the worst Saladin could throw at him. Saladin outlived his rival by mere months. He died in March 1193, his empire already fracturing as his sons and brothers fought over the pieces. Two giants who defined an era, both gone before the century turned. But Arsuf endured. Why? Why does this single battle still matter over 800 years later? It wasn't the largest battle of the Crusades. It wasn't the most decisive in terms of territory gained. Richard's strategic situation barely changed. He held the coast before Arsuf, he held the coast after. So what makes it legendary? The answer lies in what Richard proved that day. He proved that discipline beats aggression. Think about what Saladin's strategy required. It required the Crusaders to be predictable, to be emotional, to value honor over survival and glory over tactics. For a century, that assumption had been correct. Crusader knights charged when provoked. They broke formation to avenge fallen comrades. They threw away advantages in pursuit of the enemy. Saladin had built his entire military doctrine around this weakness, and Richard made it worthless. By refusing to charge for 16 days, by enduring harassment that would have broken lesser armies, Richard turned Saladin's strength into vulnerability. The horse archers had to get closer and closer. They had to take more risks. They had to commit. And when they finally committed, Richard destroyed them. There's a lesson here that extends far beyond medieval warfare. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Not nothing forever. Not passive acceptance. But strategic patience. Waiting for the moment when action will actually matter instead of acting just to feel like you're doing something. Saladin expected Richard to react, to be provoked, to let emotion drive strategy. Richard refused. He watched his men die and did nothing, because doing something would have killed them all. He absorbed punishment hour after hour, waiting for the exact moment when striking back would work. That's not cowardice. That's not passivity. That's supreme aggression held in check until it could be unleashed at maximum effect. The Hospitallers understood this by the end. They'd begged to charge all day. They'd cursed Richard's caution. Some of them probably thought their king was a coward. And then they saw what happened when they finally hit the Ayyubid line. They saw enemies who couldn't escape, who had no room to maneuver, who died in heaps because they'd been lured too close by crusaders who wouldn't take the bait. The Hospitallers had spent 5 hours in hell. They'd earned that charge. And when it came, it was worth every minute of suffering. That's the exchange Richard understood. Pain now for victory later. Discipline today for survival tomorrow. Military academies still study Arsuf. Not for the cavalry tactics. Those are obsolete. Not for the specific formations. Those belong to another age. They study it for the principle. The principle that says warfare isn't about who hits hardest. It's about who chooses when and where the hitting happens. Saladin chose the time and place for 2 weeks. He dictated the terms. He controlled the tempo. And he lost. Because Richard refused to fight on Saladin's terms. He refused to engage until the engagement favored him. He let the enemy exhaust themselves against his patience. When Richard finally struck, it wasn't a reaction. It wasn't desperation. It was a trap springing shut. Here's the thing about patience as a strategy. It's brutal. It's ugly. It doesn't look like winning while you're doing it. For 16 days, Richard's army looked like victims. They looked like a column of men, slowly being bled to death. Anyone watching would have said Saladin was winning, but appearance and reality aren't the same thing. Saladin thought he was grinding down the Crusaders. In reality, he was extending himself, committing more and more of his army, getting closer and closer to a force that was waiting for exactly that. The patience wasn't passive. It was a weapon. Richard was loading a crossbow 1 agonizing day at a time. And when he finally pulled the trigger, Saladin discovered how badly he'd miscalculated. What would have happened if Richard had charged on day 3? Day 5? Day 10? The same thing that happened at Hattin. The same thing that happened in a dozen Crusader defeats. The knights would have broken formation, chased the fleeing horse archers, gotten strung out across miles of hostile ground, and Saladin would have eaten them alive. Richard knew this. His men knew this. And still it took superhuman discipline to hold back. That's what makes Arsuf remarkable. Not the charge itself. though the charge was devastating. Not Richard's personal bravery, though he fought like a demon. What makes it remarkable is the 2 weeks before, the endless days of taking punishment, the impossible restraint. The victory was earned long before the trumpets finally sounded. So what do we take from this? 8 centuries separate us from that bloody coastal road. The weapons have changed, the tactics have changed, the entire nature of warfare has transformed beyond recognition. But human nature hasn't changed at all. We still want to react when provoked. We still want to strike back when hurt. We still confuse action with progress and aggression with strength. And we still lose because of it. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you made a bad decision because you couldn't wait? How many times have you reacted to provocation and regretted it? How many times have you known in your gut that patience was the right call, but acted anyway because doing nothing felt unbearable? That's the Hospitaler's dilemma. That's the crusader knight watching his friends die and wanting nothing more than to charge. The urge is human, it's universal, it's probably hardwired into our brains from a million years of evolution. But giving in to it is a choice. Richard made a different choice. He felt all the same urges, watched all the same suffering, and chose discipline anyway. Not because he didn't care, not because he was cold or unfeeling, because he understood that his feelings in the moment mattered less than his army's survival. Saladin was a genius. Let's be absolutely clear about that. He united an empire, recaptured Jerusalem, outmaneuvered crusader armies for decades. His name is still revered across the Muslim world, and rightfully so. But at Arsuf, his genius failed him. It failed because he assumed Richard would behave like every crusader before him. He assumed provocation would produce reaction, assumed patience would eventually crack. He was wrong, and being wrong against Richard meant watching his army shatter. There's a profound irony in the Battle of Arsuf. Saladin's entire strategy was based on patience. Wait for the crusaders to make a mistake. Don't force a battle. Let their own aggression destroy them. But Richard was more patient. He took Saladin's own weapon and turned it against him. He outwaited the master of waiting. For 16 days, both commanders played a game of chicken. Both refused to commit fully. Both waited for the other to blink. Richard blinked last. And in warfare, in life, blinking last is often the only thing that matters. The Third Crusade ended without Jerusalem. History books call it a partial success at best. But think about what Richard actually accomplished. He took an army that had been demoralized by years of defeat. He marched them through hostile territory against a superior enemy. He kept them alive through 2 weeks of constant attack. And he delivered perhaps the most crushing tactical defeat Saladin ever suffered. He didn't win the war, but he proved it could be won. He proved that Saladin wasn't invincible, that Muslim armies could be beaten in the field, that crusader discipline, properly applied, was an almost unstoppable force. The coastal cities Richard secured lasted another century. Generations of Christians lived and died in those towns because one English king understood logistics better than glory. That's not nothing. That's not failure. That's a man who did everything humanly possible with the resources he had. Jerusalem remained out of reach, the holy city that had launched 1,000 ships and 10,000 prayers. Maybe that's the real lesson. Some things can't be taken by force. Some victories are beyond even the greatest warriors. Some goals require more than courage and discipline. They require circumstances that simply don't exist. Richard looked at Jerusalem and saw the truth. He could breach those walls. He could plant his banner on the Temple Mount, and then he'd die there. His army would die there. Everything he'd built would crumble. So he turned away, not in defeat, in recognition. The wisdom to know what's possible and what isn't, That might be the rarest form of courage there is. September 7th, 1191. A narrow coastal road. 12,000 men. 5 hours of hell. And one king who understood something his enemy didn't expect. Richard didn't crush Saladin's army because he was braver. His knights didn't hit harder than anyone else. His tactics weren't revolutionary. He won because he refused to fight until fighting would actually work. He won because he understood that patience isn't weakness, restraint isn't cowardice, and sometimes, the most aggressive thing you can do is absolutely nothing until the perfect moment arrives, and then you hit with everything you have. The trumpets finally sounded around 3 in the afternoon. 6 blasts, 2 groups of 3, and an army that had endured the unendurable finally charged. They charged into an enemy that had made one mistake, just one. They'd gotten too close, too committed, too confident. One mistake was all Richard needed. 800 years later, we're still talking about what happened next.